So my primary research is in American legal and institutional history, particularly the 20th century United States. And during this year, I'll be focusing primarily on the history of policing and civil rights enforcement. I think too often federal civil rights and policy is kind of grouped together, and so you get everything from social and economic programs to the law enforcement side of it as one issue. And what I'm trying to do is separate out the law enforcement side of civil rights policy in the 30s and 40s in particular. And doing so, I argue, really makes the arguments of states' rights or local control, which are often just dismissed as kind of either politics or just racism of federal officials, makes us take it a little bit more seriously, because law enforcement policy across the federal bureaucracy was very constrained, very narrow, and really very deferential to local interests. I was really drawn to Australia in particular because there's certain kind of commonalities between the American and Australian past, and it's kind of linked to the British Empire, but the two societies have really evolved in very different ways, particularly when it comes to the organization of their government institutions. And so for me, it was just really interesting to study American history from a place that had a similar background, but ended up developing in very different ways. My dissertation looks at the history of the Justice Department in the Franklin Roosevelt years, so the 1930s and 40s. And basically for me, the big question was of federal power and its limits in this period. And I wanted to really drill down on a specific agency, and an agency that didn't have all that much to do with the New Deal. It wasn't really tied explicitly to any of the big New Deal economic programs, but it was one that nevertheless expanded tremendously in this period. And the big kind of takeaway for me from that was that, you know, the federal government expanded not only in kind of economic areas, but also across the board in policing, in prison reform, and antitrust enforcement. One of the big takeaways from that period is that cooperation works really well when it's on a personal rather than institutional basis. I mean, the FBI had formal ties with police departments, but really much of the information that they got, the tips, the kind of personal, the aid with actual cases, was really from individual officers, some of whom who had been trained in FBI police academies, some who personally knew agents within the FBI or had worked with the FBI in previous cases. And so I think it was much easier for them to cooperate with the FBI and not really see that rivalry between local and federal interests. I think it's very easy to be suspicious of an agency in the abstract, but when you're talking about a specific officer who you've worked with and had positive experiences with, I think some of those rivalries start to really melt away.